One of the main issues is that you constantly are uh, adding water to the mixture, and this is a problem because as soon as every time you put the brush inside of the water tank, you're adding more water to the mixture. Then you keep the mixtures alive for too long. That means that you need to load water constantly, and however the color can be perceived still pure somehow on the palette, the reality is that this is because it's concentrated. It's like a lake or a pond. In a pond, you see water, but you don't necessarily has to see the depth, the depth of that liquid, let's say, right? So seeing the colors in the palette is not a good way to check uh, the, the thickness and the viscosity. Paint should be creamy, not liquid, right? If it's liquid, it's two options. First of all, is a wash or is an ink. However, inks normally are more oily. The feeling is more oily than watery. Or is because it has a lot of dilution. So that means it looks more like watercolor, right? Indeed, liquid watercolor is like the perfect example of how most of the miniature painters dilute constantly the paint. And this is one of the main reasons why this happened, is because this fake and insistent concept of Games Workshop and magazines of dilute the paint constantly. People, you don't have to dilute the paint every time, right? You just need to dilute the paint when you want some transparency. And people will tell you, well, you need to dilute the paint to have more fluidity. Sometimes, sometimes yes. Obviously, if you use chalky paints like Reaper, then you need to dilute because water is a medium that added to the acrylic gives you sort of fluidity. But you know this concept, I don't know how to explain this in English properly, but water is it doesn't give you um, hydration like moisture. Water doesn't moisture, you know. But you need to understand that if you are using pigments that are chalky, which are chalky, Reaper, Scale 75, Jo Sonja, and then you have some other paints that are in between, like AK, Interactive. Some colors and how you treat them can become chalky because the color is not only how the color is inside of the pot, instead of how you use that color. Like for example, if you take Nocturna paints and you dilute them too much, you will end up doing this kind of fuzzy feeling that is related with chalkiness, right? So certain brands are chalky. Is this good? Is this wrong? It's not nothing good, it's nothing wrong, it's just a fact. It's just a property, a physical property. Normally, all the brands that are highly related with a matte finish, these ones used to be chalky. And these ones are also related with low fluidity. That means you cannot trace longer. You can do short brushstrokes. Why some people can do marvelous things with those paints? Because they can adapt their own way of painting to the kind of paints they use. For example, Kirill used a lot of Reaper paints, right? Or Chimera, that they are chalky as well. Chimera is also chalky. Less chalky because the viscosity is a little bit more. It's not a flat paint as much. It's more fluid paint. My suggestion is not use flow improver because this becomes you lazy and it gives you a fake idea of fluidity, right? Fluidity can be achieved by mixing properties of different brands. That's why I never use only one brand, and normally also because I mix all the time, and I mix all the time not only to get the color or the tone or the nuance, color, tone, nuance, color, human, tone, Spanish, nuance, silly, for example, right? Um, not only to get this specific name of the color. I want a green ochre, not very desaturated, okay, for example, right? But also to get the right viscosity, thickness, and fluidity of the paint. And that's the reason why I always used to mix with inks. Inks are flow improvers. They can enhance the pigmentation, the color, but they can also give you a better fluidity because inks are somehow oily, right? So that's the reason why I mix so much. But there are some other painters that they don't mix that much and that they do more like pre-made progressions, or that maybe they don't have pre-made progressions, but they select specific colors like David Arroba or MARCAS, for example, to say some of them, or Kirill Kanaev, right? These guys are more numeric in how they perceive the colors. So each brand has their own properties that could be good or wrong, right? So in this case, what's the good thing about Reaper and why someone who is probably the best painter in the world, like Kirill, why he has used it so much? Because you don't do long brushstrokes. Because it has no fluidity and it's chalky, it will be dry. The filling is dry. It doesn't allow you to use your brushstroke for a long time, right? So that means that the brushstroke should be shorter. David Arroba does this, and he plays indeed with this dry filling to create sort of texture, right? MARCAS, he also has very short brushstrokes, ping, 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 ping. Or when he applies lateral brushstrokes to create patches, a patch is using the last pigmentation, the last part of the pigment of a glaze. You know, you dilute the color to make it transparent, to play with the effect that color creates on top of a previous layer. This is a glaze or a filter. A filter would be, in general, a glaze will be a very controlled filter, and the patch is, or the patchment, it will be the last sandy, dry pigment that leaves or that is left after this lateral brushstroke. And Marc, for example, plays a lot with this, right? So this is not something absolute. Every painter, especially great painters, we or they have to have many different brushstrokes, and the brushstroke is like the signature. Like, for example, I love how David Arroba creates those super dry effects, right? Because the final result with so many layers, and because he creates enough levels of contrast and types of contrast, the final look, it doesn't look dry, but his brushstroke is very short and dry, right? And I admire this. I love it because I cannot paint like this. This is not my brushstroke because this is not my signature. It's his signature. My brushstrokes, for example, are quite long normally because I paint very fast and with big brushes, right? So I paint like this quickly, and then I make a mess, and then I start refining and I move to shorter brushstrokes and more precise brushstrokes. But I always start from an overall painting where my long brushstrokes helps me, right? So in my case, I use not diluted paint instead of fluid paint, which is a different thing, right? As soon as you are adding water or you are cleaning the brush, which is another mistake, guys, don't clean the brush constantly. You don't need it. If you're working in a progression, obviously, if you're painting the face and suddenly you have to paint the cape, which is blue, then you have to clean the brush a little bit, right? But if you're painting things that has related colors, like, for example, you're painting leather and you're painting skin tone and you're painting golden non-metallic, all of them are tertiary tones, all of them. Golden non-metallic will be a kind of ochre, or it will start with a kind of brown, for example. Leather, it will be a kind of brown by itself. And skin is a brown or a tertiary tone that has been even desaturated to become it pastel. But all of them has initially the same tones, or at least the same families inside, which means all of them, basically. So instead of cleaning the brush all the time, you can use the paint you have on the brush to create the next mixture. But for this, your mixture should be big, and your mixtures, brother, are very small. That means that to keep that color, you need to clean the brush constantly. And every time you clean the brush, you add more water. So you thin down the pigment, so you attack the pigment, you reduce the pigment, and you make it more chalky. Which paints are more versatile? For example, the ones that are more creamy, AK Interactive, Vallejo. Not all the colors, but most of them. If you see Vallejo, the consistency, the viscosity is more versatile. That means that it's in between. It's a color that is not fully matte, it's not super matte like Scale 75 or Reaper, but is more versatile because it allows you to do more different brush strokes, use it with more different dilutions, right? And avoid looking chalky. Then Citadel as well. These are even less because they are more plastic. Indeed, when you open the pot or when you pour the paint on the palette, you will feel the difference. The paint that goes down, they became shallow, more flat. That means that they have no consistency, they have no viscosity, and they go down. These ones will look fluid by themselves, but as soon as you take them and you trace with them, they will break the brushstroke, right? The brushstroke will break. It will not last long, right? The completely opposite will be inks, that they are the most fluid, but obviously inks, most of the times, they are quite satin. So that's the reason why you must mix different brands to get to the point where you can have something that is not very satin, is something between matte and satin, slightly satin. It has certain viscosity to keep the paint, right? To keep the paint alive, and it has fluidity. And then if you need transparency on this, you will reduce the opacity by adding more water, but on top of a mixture that it's already not chalky. But if you add water to a paint that is already chalky, you will make it even more chalky. Right? A good test is to take one color that are similar from each brand and try them and check them. So how to avoid chalkiness? Avoiding using chalky pigments or mixing pigments from different brands that have different properties, right? Is this related to, for example, heavy bodies? Depends. For example, heavy bodies from Scale 75, they are very colorful, good pigments in terms of vibrancy, but you have to use them in short ranges, in short spaces, because they are chalky. The same as Joe Sonja, similar, right? If you go for Liquitex is in between. It's not a matte paint. It's also not a glossy paint. It's something in between. And it's creamy. All the paints that are more creamy, these ones are very versatile, good ones, right? Then you have the extreme in heavy bodies, which is golden acrylic. Golden acrylic is super glossy. It's not dry at all, right? But it's very glossy and it's very transparent. Normally, the colors that are more glossy, normally, unless they are plastic paints like old Citadel range, for example, that they have this kind of plastic feeling, golden acrylic are not designed to be thinned down. You can do it. You can use them thinned down. You can create glazes with it. But they are also created for canvas painters to use groups of paint directly, because they are quite transparent, right? So they have low opacity. So if you want something more fluid, like golden acrylic or Liquitex in terms of heavy body stuff, but you want a better coverage, you mix the colors with Scale 75, Scale Artist, for example, right? If you want Scale 75, because you have the whole range, Artist, Scale Artist, but you need more fluidity, you mix it with an ink that gives you this oily fluidity. Make sense? And achieve an intermediate viscosity that will be enough for coverage and enough for tracing. It will not trace as long as you will trace with the brush with an ink. As soon as I am creating my colors on the palette, and that's one of the main reasons why my palettes are so big, because first of all I create multiple microtones because the capability to create nuances is bigger because my mixtures are bigger, so there is more mistake and of course more success as well creating different tones, because I am not obsessed by trying to get the same tone once and once again. And if you check, which is something that is difficult to see on the videos because you don't see me taking water or not, but I promise you that most of the times I'm not even taking water, not at all. I only take a little bit of water when I feel that I need a little bit of fluidity because it's getting dry and I don't want to redo the mixture. But one thing that I do a lot is to change the mixture constantly. A good suggestion is to see the videos of the last Fact Smoothness I did with Major Roney, right? Which is a series of 3 videos, where you will see how I modified the skin tone, for example, constantly creating new skin tones on top, right? And I don't clean the brush. I use the pigment that is on the brush to create the next tone, right? Obviously, sometimes you have to clean the brush. But what I want to say with this is that when you clean the brush, you need to then also absorb the paint. The hair of the brush should be moisture, but not wet. It's a different thing. Moisture is slightly moisture. Wet means, at least to me, not humid or full of liquid. Not full of liquid because then you are adding water to the mixture and we don't want this, right? I'm going to make an explanation, a quick explanation, and I hope that this is clear for everybody, okay? Because I've seen that this is something redundant that is happening all the time. That's the reason why I'm doing this video, and I hope that this will be useful for many people, hopefully. Wet palette can be anything, can be the lid of a box, which is much cheaper. Maybe it has 0 cost. This is my wet palette. This is my wet palette. Is a tray, is a plastic tray that cost me €1. Then this is the sponge, which is, you know, those sponges for cleaning, a white one that I found, and I've been using this for 6 months until it starts to smell bad, and then I change for another one. It cost maybe €2. €2, the big one. So I have €2 of this, maybe last 1 year, right? And then I have this, which is oven paper, baking paper, right? Is this €2. So in total I am spending, I don't know, €6, maybe $7, maybe €5 to €7 buying something that lasts 2 years. Second, the wet palette should be big. Why? Because then you can make many more mixtures, right? And then you don't have to be constrained by creating super tiny mixtures instead of something big that can create branches of different tonalities that goes all over, right? So this is my recommendation, obviously. Second, does it has to be permanently wet? No, sometimes I use it when it's dry just because I'm lazy. I don't want to go to the bathroom to take more water. It doesn't matter, because if you're able to create your own mixtures, that means that you can create them constantly. So you don't need necessarily to preserve your mixtures 10 days. Okay, so let's go and try the colors. I have taken skin tones from different brands, and I will take another skin tone from, for example, scale 75, and I will take another skin tone from an ink, which is not really the best in terms of strength and fluidity, because it's something intermediate. Roney is stronger in terms of pigment, but it will be good enough. I really like Aero color.
And I'm going to take also golden acrylic, kind of like something similar at least, and Liquitex. So what will be the procedure to take paint and use it before we go onto a miniature? First, the paint, the brush should be moisture, but that's it, moisture. With a little bit of water, not with excess, to make it pointy, okay? To keep the tip sharp. So, different paints with different properties. I'm going to explain you those ones. There are more paints. Obviously, I'm not going to try all the paints in the world because I don't have them. I have many, but not all of them. How should we use the paints? You will see how the paint reacts. Goop, you see, it has thickness, it has volume. Ripper. You will perceive that is more liquid. You see, it moves. And this, with the time, will go down, will get flattened, right? Then we have, for example, Liquitex, heavy body. You will see the goop is even more consistent. You can create shapes. You cannot do this with Ripper because Ripper has not tension. You know, it goes down. This one as well. You see that it's going down? Do you see that the goop is losing his strength? But not as much as Ripper, just a little bit, right? So this is in between. I'm going to place the goops or the heavy bodies, the colors that has more viscosity and density next to each other so that you can separate, differentiate. This is golden acrylic. This is one of the very rare ones that has very good coverage. Normally, they don't have good coverage. And you can see it here. You see? Low coverage. Normally, they are very transparent. Not all of them. It depends on the colors. And then we have this golden flesh from Scale Artist. Also, a goop. But you will perceive, maybe not on the video, but I can promise you that on reality and in person, you can see that this looks less plastic than these two. And this one looks also less vibrant. The color is a little bit more matte. You can perceive it. Then we have Nocturna, for example. Nocturna has several different pigments. Some of them are more flat than others, and some of them are more has more coverage than others. Some of them are more transparent than others. You know, in this case, the flesh tones has better coverage than many other colors. You know, this happens also very much with tertiary tones. The tertiary tones, especially flesh tones, normally they have a better coverage than, for example, primary tones in these kind of brands that they are not quite viscose and that they are not also super powerful in terms of pigments like these ones, you know? So these brands like this, like P3, like Citadel, they have a quite nice coverage. But you see that the color flattens quite quickly, and this will start drying very fast because the more flat is the color, the faster it dries. Then we have this intermediate pigment, which is this salmon rose from Vallejo. Vallejo is very versatile. Is in between. That's the reason why most of the painters use Vallejo because is a brand that allows you to paint in many different ways. And then this is Schminke, it's an aero color. You will see how it will be very flat because it's very liquid. It's an ink, right? But it will be very powerful, right? Ink. This is an ink. Okay. I will take another ink from Dowler Roney. You will see that it's super strong, right? These, however, are inks unless you move the palette, and obviously the flow due to inclination starts to move. These ones will stay long attached because the pigment is very thin and it's very well attached. That's another difference between inks and regular colors. The regular colors, when you dilute them with water, you thin down and the pigment spread, while inks, they stay attached because they have, let's say, this is a way to say, because probably someone from an expert from a chemistry will tell me that I'm lying, and indeed maybe I am lying, but there's a way to explain it. It's like inks, they have more numbers of pigment troops inside less space. You know, they are thinner and more attached, and they are more concentrated, right? So this is a super concentrated color. Okay, so now, and I'm going to show you the process that I suggest you to take paint and then work with it. Not everybody does it in the same way, but this is how I recommend to my students to do. I have paper towel, and I have regular paper, and I have the palette. So first thing, I take color from the palette. This is Vallejo. The paint will be slightly moisture because I already have some water on the brush. I extend it, but not so much, and this is something you shouldn't do. You see? 3 hours doing this. No, bro. Just make it enough that it looks creamy. Imagine that I want to start mixing, and I want to make it a little bit more reddish. So for example, I take something from here, and I mix it. You will see that this instantly changes the color because the ink is very powerful. However, I'm not taking too much. You know, if I add too much, it will instantly turn it pinkish. Anyway, the feeling you have to have is something creamy. And the brush, you see, has to be loaded. The first thing we do is to remove the excess. One, done. All the excess is there. You don't have excess here. The next thing is flipping backwards. You see that movement? To make the brush pointy. And see what happened. Don't you feel that it's already very dry? Check. It breaks is because it has low fluidity. What does it mean? That Vallejo allows you to have a good coverage in not very long brush strokes, right? It's not the one that is more dry, not at all. It's something intermediate. But imagine that we add more ink. I told you, ink increase fluidity, right? And I'm going to add another ink, that one, which is also an ink from Aerocolor. And I'm going to create also a skin tone. It's a similar tone, slightly darker. I can get to the same previous tone by adding a little bit more of other tones. I'm searching for my tone, creating my viscosity, right? And now I get something similar. You see, it's not the same tone, but it's quite similar. So creating tones, if you control the colors, is quite simple. Then I check how creamy it is on the palette. So at this stage, I can add a little bit of water just to moisture the brush, just a little bit. This is much more than enough. I add it, and now I feel that it's not as creamy. It's a little bit more liquid, right? I remove the excess. You see, I don't do that. 3 minutes here, and then wrong. Don't trace, because you see that you're removing too much paint, okay? Just one touch. And then on the paper that is less absorbent, we flip, rotating backwards, right? And now I can trace longer. I can trace longer. It's still, you see, it still works. And another trick is that if I have to make a long brush stroke, I can also rotate a little bit to redistribute the paint through the body of the brush. At some point it starts breaking, and this is already chalky. So now I have to reload. again, and I do the same. Pink, pink. And now I can concentrate the color, and have a longer brushstroke.
Brothers and sisters, I have created colors for scale 75, right? I have designed colors. I have help with the idea of chimera colors. I have worked for almost every company under this company or for this company. So it means inside of the company or as a freelancer, right? I have tried almost all the companies because they give me the colors, or most of them, they give me colors for free, right? So I don't care. I'm just telling you the right thing to tell, which is my experience, right? Then you can trust me or not. Then you can change your method or not, but at least reflect about what I'm saying, because I'm not inventing anything. I'm just proving you this. In every range, each color works slightly different than the other. Not all of them are built up in the same way. Not all of them has the same coverage. Not all of them. This is something that happens. I don't know why. Go to a chemistry and ask. I don't know why. I'm just telling you in general thoughts, about different ranges. I am telling you general properties. Obviously, then for example, some inks from Dauleroni has super great coverage. Some others are more transparent.
So you will see, for example, let's explain the colors. Nocturna, as soon as I take the color was already drying, is because it's very liquid, it's very fluid, but has very low coverage. So I do the same with the brush, low coverage. I'm not mixing with anything else. Does it means that Nocturna are bad colors? No. That means that you have to use them either very quick, or also that you have to use them for maybe be more thin on your painting, like using glazes, microtones, or is perfect for working on top of something that has already been worked previously. Like for example, here to create some patches, accumulate color, with certain transparency, right? So for this, good color, right? Is this a good color to cover? No. Can you cover? Yes, obviously. If you insist and you create 100 layers, you will finally cover, right? But also take into account that because it's so thin, it doesn't dry at the same time. And as soon as you overwork, it can happen this, that you remove the paint and you create this, a mistake. Vallejo, more creamy, better coverage, with no dilution. But Vallejo can be also used diluted. Now I'm adding water. I am adding water. Remove the excess. Search for sharpening the brush, and you can also use it as glazes or patches or the same as Nocturna. Right. Why I can prefer Nocturna at some point? Because maybe I like some colors of Nocturna that Vallejo don't have. But this is more versatile. Okay, check how long it can trace. Obviously, and you will also be able to differentiate types of colors, you see? Because these colors that are intermediate, that they are more creamy, more plastic, normally they don't break when you start losing pigment on the brush. They look less opaque, they look more transparent, but they don't break. Now I'm going to take AK Interactive, this one. They will be similar to Vallejo. Some colors that are very different. I really like the selection of colors. They have very beautiful pastel colors. I don't have water on the brush, it's just moisture because I didn't dry the brush, right? But I didn't add more water. And you will see how it's very creamy. It has pretty nice coverage. You can extend it for a long time and it will not break. It will just break when it's completely dry, or you can re-alive with a little bit of water, a little bit, but not for a long time, because as soon as you add more water, you will see, and this is one of the main problems that many of you have, that you are constantly adding water. So you're turning paints that are thick or paints that are creamy in watercolor paints. You see that it will even change the tone because you're thinning it down. You see that this is quite transparent, while if I take it directly straight away from the pot, which is not necessary to thin down all the paints constantly, this is a big lie, you see. One thing I do is that I renew the color in the same area, and the same as, for example, this, still alive, you see? This still has viscosity. If I need to make a new skin tone, I will mix it on top, not replacing completely, instead of moving forward and creating the new tone in a new space, so I can keep a little bit of the previous one and I can modify my color here, right? Okay, so I'm gonna clean the brush because now I want to take only color from AK Interactive. You see? No dilution, just a little bit of humidity on the brush. Check. You see how creamy it is? It's like cheese, it's like cream cheese. Check. With water, without water. Obviously, it's not the best color to cover, because then there is another property for to take into account with coverage, which is how close is the color that you're going to apply in opposition to the previous coat, which in this case is very dark and brown. So there is a huge distance between them, and that's why this color is difficult to cover on top. But you see, the same exact color, diluted, no diluted. Obviously, it's not perfect because I told you, this is something, these two, Vallejo and AK, are something in between. They are versatile colors. They don't have the best coverage, but they have a decent coverage. They don't have the best fluidity, but they have a decent fluidity. They are good for transparencies, but maybe not as good as, for example, Nocturna, that they are already prepared for creating filters, transparencies, or glazes. Okay? Then, let's go for Reaper. We have Reaper here. It will be very liquid, right? Check. You will perceive that is somehow transparent. It doesn't cover perfectly, right? And as soon as it dries, you will see what I'm talking about. You see that it's not as strong as you can perceive on the brush or on the paper, It's somehow transparent, right? Reaper are super matte. Not all the colors, and indeed, these core colors are not like super matte. But some others, well, in general, these colors that are super matte, they are really good for, you see that as soon as you have a little bit of water on the brush, a little bit, they are very transparent. So you can use them and they are sandy. Don't you feel that it's earthy? That the feeling, it looks like fuzzy? Okay, so how I use these Reaper colors? In short brushstrokes, accumulating the paint in specific areas. Because then, as we are not extending the color, we don't play that much with transparency. So basically what I do is this. You can use it for stippling. They work really well because they are very matte, and when you concentrate the color will look nice, will look more solid than if you extend. As soon as you extend, it became a chalky feeling, right? Obviously, this chalkiness is much easier to see on a figure, and in my figures are more difficult to see because I have so many layers. And this one, for example, it has so many layers of different brands and colors, and it has been already matte with a super matte varnish in intermediate stage, but this was glossy as a caramel. And it has so much layers that it's difficult to create something chalky because the base is already not porous, right? Next colors, and I'm going to finish. This is Liquitex. Check. Really great coverage, but super dry as soon as you extend them. So these colors that are heavy body, they break instantly. But these ones can be added. You can add a little bit of water, take a goop, extend well, distribute well the water, create your level of creaminess as you want with a little bit of water. Don't use too much water, and then you can extend more. And you see that it can become transparent at some point, but it doesn't break that much. You have, let's say, more, you can extend it for longer time. But if you want the strength, the power, the vibrancy of these heavy body colors that are normally the most vibrant, but you want more fluidity, what can you use? Instead of water, you use ink. If you have the same color in ink, perfect. If not, we can make a small variation. I am adding a little bit of this crimson, and to reduce the crimson, you can add a little bit of, for example, this Vallejo, it was salmon skin or something. And I will find not the same color, but something similar. You see, it's similar. It's slightly more grayish, slightly more desaturated. But now, the good thing is that I have enough fluidity, enough coverage, enough many things. And that if I want transparency, I can add more water and the pigment will be well distributed, it will not break, and we can do nice glazes, for example. So the good thing about the goops, the paint that came in goops in like heavy body, is that you can create your own stage of paint, right? Differences between Liquitex and golden acrylic is more glossy. Liquitex is satin, something in between. And then scale 75 are the one that is more matte, but is also a little bit chalky. Okay, so obviously, guys, and this is something that you can test in at your home. For example, you can say, Alfonso, I don't want this transparency, right? Why it doesn't have coverage? Alfonso cheat us because it has a lot of transparency. No, brother, it's because the color is too far away from the previous one. So if you want to build up, it's like if you want to cover a black coat with yellow, you will need 100,000 million coats, or you will need to start with brown, then ochre plus yellow, and then pure yellow, and then it will work, right? Or base coated in white or in ochre, and then you add yellow. Well, this is the same. So if I want to cover, the first thing I will do is to create a color that is closer to this, which is a brown. So then I can create something slightly more brownish. One layer. You see that it's still transparent, and then when it's dry, I can continue adding layers and continue adding layers dry. So three steps. If you add, for example, an ink with coverage, for example, a Dowler-Rowney ink, and you can say, okay, but it's not the same color. Yeah, but this will be not the final color that you will see. These are intermediate tones that I use to reach the one that I want. For example, this has very good coverage because Dowler-Rowney inks had pretty decent coverage. If you mix it with the previous Liquitex mixture, you create an intermediate tone that, with no dilution, in just a few layers, will cover everything easily. However, as you see, because it has certain transparency, the color doesn't react the same here than there, right? So that's the reason why colors affect each other also by superposition, by what is underneath. And that is also important. So I'm mixing a little bit of everything here to summarize things that are important. First of all, what kind of pigment you use? Some of them has better coverage, right, than others. Normally, the ones that has better coverage, they have to be applied more dense, like a base coat, like a capa base, which is just a color straight out of the pot, or maybe just with a little bit of water that is already on the brush, because the brush is moisture. It doesn't mean that you have to thin down the paint, right? Full coverage. The more layers you have, the more you can thin down the paint, because it will take advantage of the previous layers that were already settled down. That's another thing. The first thing, what kind of pigments you're using. Some of them, as I have said, better coverage. Some of them has more strength, more vibrancy. Some of them has more fluidity. They trace better. But all the acrylics can be mixed. So you mix properties from each other, right? If you see that your brushstroke ends dry, like quite quickly, maybe you need to improve the flow. For this, I will not recommend to use flow improvers, because this is an external medium that will make you lazy, and you can add more paints, because you're not also adding more fluidity, instead of also you are enriching the pigment by adding another paint. In this case, an ink could be useful. Depending on which brands you have, maybe you might end up seeing that maybe all your brands are super dry and are super matte, because some kind of god from the painting worlds told you the world should be matte. That's bullshit, people. That is bullshit. Life is not matte. Some things are matte, some things are not matte. But even more, you can paint your face, the face of your figure, like a caramel, and finally you can matte it. You can make it matte with an ultra matte varnish from AK, for example, which is something simple. And by doing this, you will not lose the richness of the satin colors, because every satin color or glossy color will be much more rich than a matte color, okay? Then, the viscosity of the paint matters as well. Then, related with the palette, the colors that are more flat, that when you pour them, they became thin and the color goes down, these colors will dry very fast, and most likely they will appear chalky. While the colors that stays as a goop, right, these colors, they can have other problems, like most of them, they will be satin, most probably, right? Maybe some of them, they don't have good coverage or whatever, right? But you will avoid them making your paint chalky, right? Then the steps. Make the mixture, look how creamy it is. Is it creamy? Good. Is it too liquid? Good if you want to make glazes or transparent techniques of transparency, right? But if you want to cover, or if you want to gain a solid color, it's better to make the color, to have a color that is creamy on the palette. You have to feel it by yourself, right? You take the color, then 1 millisecond on the paper towel to reduce the excess, and then you flick backwards, rotating to make the tip of the brush pointy and to make it more sharp, right? And then also, by doing this on the paper, you will feel already, you will see how much it lasts, the brush stroke. So it means how much fluid it is, and when it will break. If you see that it's breaking, the paint, that it becomes dry quite instantly, that means that you have to paint in shorter brush strokes. If you see that the color lasts for a long time, that means that you can cover it quite quickly, or because you can use it in many parts, it says the color lasts for a long time on the brush, so you don't need to reload, right? Or that you can make a longer brush stroke. Another tip, keep your mixtures alive constantly. That will keep the color alive, and you will not depend on the wet palette that much. But also, However, you can then put it on the fridge and the next day you see the colors, they look alive. Check them, because maybe they look alive from the top, from an aerial perspective, but as soon as you take it and you trace over a white paper, you will see that the color has been thinned down because of the water, that you're using, and because of the water that is exuding or that is sweating the baking paper or the wet palette paper. Also, another thing, the wet palette papers that they sell, they are not good ones to keep the goops because they absorb. You will see they will be porous, right? While the baking paper keeps the paint, at least in one session, it keeps the paint without absorbing it. So I don't recommend you to use those papers that you have to wet first, these ones. In my opinion, this will make your finish, your painting more chalky quite easily because it absorbs the paint. We don't want this. Obviously, you can tell me, Alfonso, I work in this other way and it works for me. If it works for you, it works for you perfectly fine. But I'm telling this because I know that there are many people that has problems and that they make chalky finishes without knowing exactly why is this happening, right? So I hope that this has been clear enough, and I hope that this has helped everybody else on the academy. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.